Hello everyone and welcome to the Games Monster podcast with me, your host David Pistansky, and today we will be getting into everything that we didn't cover in part 1 of our Nintendo 64 25th anniversary retrospective. So the Nintendo 64, if you didn't catch our last episode, do check it out, but it is 25 years old. 25 years ago, the Nintendo 64 was first available to get into the hands of gamers, which obviously for the UK, because it came out in 1997, I think it wouldn't be 25 years until we got it, until next year, because 1997, yeah, maths. But today we'll be talking about the games that we didn't discuss last time. So if you haven't checked out last week's episode, do check it out. We discuss things like Super Mario 64, the games from Rare. We speak about the Nintendo 64 and how it did, coming out late when compared to PlayStation and Sega Saturn. We'll recap on some of this, I'm sure, but I was going through I've got a list of all of the N64 games. I was picking out which ones are ones worth talking about, big ones. I think we got as far as like Doom 64. We're going to skip over a lot of things, but we'll start off here. Dr. Mario 64. Now, this was one of the last N64 games to come out. In fact, this is something I've got to check this fact here. According to this, unless that's wrong, okay, it says that it only came out in North America. I thought it came out in Europe. I don't know about that. Maybe it's just that I've got it Dr. Mario 64 for the Virtual Console or something, but according to this, it only came out in America. I have played it, maybe it's on the Virtual Console, but this was a game that was a puzzle game at the end of the N64's lifespan, and this was an example of Nintendo just putting out, like throwing a bone to, people bought the N64, we're not quite ready for the GameCube to come out. Let's chuck out Dr. Mario 64. It'll be basically the same as Dr. Mario that we've done on the NES and the Super NES, except for unlike the Super NES version, it won't have Tetris with it, so there won't be Tetris and Dr. Mario and have a combined game mode. But from what I remember, yeah, good game. Let's see what else we've got on the list. Duke Nukem 64. Now, this is a game which was obviously Duke Nukem 3D, and it came out in an era where the N64 and Nintendo were being like cautious about having too many adult-themed games. So Duke Nukem 64 obviously has got like lots of violence. It's got lots of swearing. It has nudity in it. And I think there may have been some elements of nudity that remained in it. I didn't actually have Duke Nukem 64, but I know it so well just because it is Duke Nukem 3D and I've read about these differences. That Duke Nukem 64, it may have had like limited amounts of nudity, but then like the babes that you would save on it were more covered. It might have like made it so that instead of killing the babes that you were like saving from the aliens, and I know it sounds a bit arse about face, but to save them, you would put them out of their misery, kind of like I guess in Alien or something, where you see someone that's caught like in a cocoon and they're like, kill me, and I think that would be the idea on the original Duke Nukem 3D, but you would actually save them on Duke Nukem 64. And then the other thing, so what they take away they then give back in another area. Duke Nukem 64, they put it into, there was some 3D rendered like polygonal characters rather than it just being like the 2D sprites. So you got something extra, you also lost something. I think it was a 4-player game on the N64, but like again, I had it for the PC, and I've since had it on other things as well, so never picked up Duke Nukem 64. Likewise, I never got Duke Nukem 0 Hour, and I feel like there may have been a third Duke Nukem game for the N64, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it is just 0 Hour. Oh no, there was another game along the same lines of 0 Hour that came out on the PS1. Oh, I'll see if I can find out what that is very quickly. I know this is completely off point because now I'm going to be talking about a character Duke Nukem. I'm going to be talking about a PlayStation 1 game, so what was it called? Time to Kill, Duke Nukem Time to Kill, and then the N64 got 0 Hour. Again, never played it. Wish I did, but never found it cheap. Earthworm Jim 3D, didn't get the great reviews. Again, didn't play it. ECW Hardcore Revolution. I'll spend a couple of minutes here just talking about wrestling games on the Nintendo 64 because there were a lot of them and they sold well. And this was in an era where wrestling hadn't been a big thing again, hadn't been a big thing, and it became a big thing again. And I always feel that it's kind of overlooked the importance of video games for the resurgence of wrestling, because there were wrestling games in the early 90s, WWF Raw, WWF Royal Rumble, Super WrestleMania, things like this, and they were never seen as being that good. If you're a wrestling fan, you may have got a kick out of them, but they were nothing compared to like a Street Fighter 2 or Mortal Kombat. In the mid-90s, we did get the very Mortal Kombat-like WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, and followed by the much inferior WWF In Your House. But after this point, everything changed because, first of all, we got the WCW versus the World for the PlayStation. We got WCW versus NWO Revenge. We got WCW versus WCW versus the World, WCW versus NWO World Tour, and then WCW/NWO Revenge from THQ. And they were seen as like, oh my god, these are fantastic wrestling games. And on the flip side, we got the WWF Warzone, followed by WWF Attitude, which to me, I always preferred those, perhaps because I preferred WWF to WCW at the time. I think I preferred the more lifelike graphics. And I think I preferred the more combo-based gameplay, because it was like you put in move combinations, like button combinations to do moves and things, whereas like the other wrestling games, the WCW ones, and to this day, they always go along like, oh, you got to press like heavy punch or light grapple, heavy grapple, and it was never quite my cup of tea. But one of the most interesting things, so I think wrestling video games got people into, oh, we want to play the wrestling video games, and then people get to know the characters in the video games, and then I think they'd actually go and watch wrestling at the time. I think it really did help professional wrestling more than it's given credit for. Not the only thing, but I think it did help it. But the interesting thing around the wrestling video games on the N64 and in that era is that the company THQ were putting out the WCW games, and the company Acclaim were putting out the WWF games. And then what suddenly happened is after WWF Attitude came out, and it was literally delayed because the wrestler Owen Hart fell to his death on a pay-per-view, on like live television. He actually died. We didn't see it happen on screen, but it happened just moments before. A few seconds later, it would have happened on TV, but it got delayed, and they had to rush to get this game out because they had lost the rights to the WWF games to THQ, who made the WCW games. And I don't quite know the order of what happened here, because maybe it was THQ had lost the rights to the WCW games, because suddenly it was EA Sports going to be making the WCW games. So EA Sports were a new contender, had the rights to WCW taken from THQ. THQ managed to then get the rights for the WWF games from Acclaim. Acclaim, suddenly left with nothing, gets the rights to the ECW company and puts out ECW Hardcore Revolution. And I definitely got this on the PlayStation. I don't know if it came out on the N64. ECW Anarchy Rules. I feel like it didn't make it to the N64. But it was just a super interesting trivia fact of how there was all these company swappings, because within a few months of each other, they'd all like swapped around who was making what, and you know, who was publishing what, and which company was with which video game company. It was very interesting. But anyway, my favourite ones there was definitely WWF Attitude. I thought it was fantastic. I then probably do like WWF Warzone just because I was into those games. ECW Hardcore Revolution was basically WWF Attitude, but with less well-known wrestlers in it. And arguably it had a little bit less here and there. They only had one new match type, which was like barbed wire ropes or something like this, and it it just meant that the gameplay, every time you ran to the ropes, you'd get hurt. So, it didn't add anything. It probably took away from anything, if anything else. But then, the famous WWF No Mercy and WrestleMania 2000 were what THQ put out on the N64 when they took over the WWF license. And people still say WWF No Mercy to this day is like the greatest wrestling game of all time. I enjoyed it. Was it my favourite? No. Anyway. Excitebike 64 I never had. Extreme G I did have. And this was like, it's like F-Zero, super fast racing game. Didn't massively get into it. I did, however, get into F-Zero X. F-Zero X on the N64. It's a challenging racing game, but it was one that I finished. And I do know that we'll speak more about this in a moment, but there was an expansion pack or expansion disc for the Nintendo 64 disc drive, which eventually came out in Japan, but we never got it in Europe, and it never came out in the US either. See what else there was. One of the first games I got was FIFA Soccer 64. Now, I'd had FIFA and like FIFA 96 on the Mega Drive, and I remember getting FIFA 64, and I played it, I completed it. The reviews said it sucked. It wasn't that great. I didn't mind it, but because I completed it so quickly, I sold it. So that was the first game I had for the N64 that I sold. And I had it for just a short while before I got rid of it. I think I may have had another FIFA game on the N64. It might have been like World Cup 98 or something like this, but I had them. If not on that, then it might have been on the PC or something else. Fighters Destiny 2, they were seen as the big fighting games for the Nintendo 64, like the 3D fighting games. Like, well, PlayStation has Tekken, Saturn has Virtua Fighter, N64 has Fighters Destiny, and the first one had some hype around it. It wasn't seen as that marvellous. It was seen as inferior to the other consoles. Fighters Destiny 2 I actually think people preferred, but there was no hype around it by then. I think it, honestly, was just like a dead series by the time the sequel came out, and the only reason the first one did at all well is because it was the only game in town, as it were. But because people were like, this isn't Tekken, by the time the sequel came out, it's like, nah, we're done with it. Let's see what else we've got here. Just going through things. Gex 64, Enter the Gecko, and Gex 3, Deep Cover Gecko. Got a couple of interesting trivia things for this. First of all, Gex 64 was the N64 version of Gex 3D, Enter the Gecko. And from all accounts, I think the N64 version was worse. It may have actually had... it definitely had less speech on it. Didn't have the CGI cutscenes. I'm trying to think if it actually had less levels, or maybe it had even a bonus extra level, which is often a thing you'd get on the N64. It would always be easier for them to put in an extra level or an extra mode rather than just have extra sound files for audio. But it was so funny because Gex 3D and 64 had the voice of Leslie Phillips, who'd been in the Carry On films in the 1960s. And he was voicing Gex, and he was perfect for it because Gex they put on the front as if he looks like James Bond. And then Leslie Phillips was like this smooth voice, like, oh, hello, ding dong. And my favourite line two favourite lines were, one he'd go, it was just randomly, this gecko would go, time for tubby bye-byes. And then this other one, he'd go, the things I do for crispy duck. And it was great. It was fantastic. And then Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko wasn't as good. It wasn't as good a game. Whereas it was a very much like a Super Mario 64 platformer where you'd go around and do different tasks and try to collect whatever the equivalent to Power Stars were. The next one, I think it made things a little bit more complicated. Also, they didn't have Leslie Phillips back, and in the UK, it was voiced by Danny John Jules, who played the cat in Red Dwarf, and it just wasn't, the character was so different as a result. And I like Red Dwarf and Danny John Jules, but for me, Deep Cover Gecko, I never completed it. Interestingly, though, talking about the voice actors of both of these games, in the US it had a different voice actor. And let me see if I got the information. No, I don't have the information. Can't find who did the voice. See if I can find it from Gex64 just to give it to you. Plot developments. Dana Gould, over 700 voiceovers for Gex. Dana Gould, who, let's see who he is. The Simpsons, Barney Fife, it says. I'm sure that isn't Barney. That can't be Barney Gumble. Maybe it is Barney. No, I thought Barney was the same guy that does Homer. Let's see who he is. Dana Gould, just on the Internet Movie Database. These are some of the fun tangents that we go on to. Additional voices from 2000 to 2020. So, and let's see who he does voices of. Air Marshal, Barney Fife. He's not someone being in The Simpsons. No, he's no one in The Simpsons. See if he's done anything else I know. Well, either way, I didn't particularly like his voice compared to Leslie Phillips. So, let's come back away from Dana Gould. Glover, that was a good game. Never played it all the way through, but it was a good platformer. So many good... This, like the N64, was the era of the 3D platformer, because everyone looked at what Nintendo achieved with Super Mario 64, and they were like, we need to do this. And there was loads, but they were all inferior compared to Super Mario 64. The nearest ones, honestly, were Banjo-Kazooie, like Conker's Bad Fur Day, Banjo-Tooie, Donkey Kong 64, even though like we covered all of these in the last episode, and Rare did kind of keep trying to make things bigger, and it was to their detriment. But Glover was a good one. Gex, 64 was a good one. I'll see if I come across any other good platformers that I can recommend. I will just quickly skim over all of this, which is easy for me to say at the end here. Just tell you what I'd say my recommendations are. GoldenEye we spoke about in the last episode. Hey You, Pikachu. Let's talk about Pokemon on the N64. Now, with how huge Pokemon was, it's an interesting time for Nintendo, just because obviously creating a Pokemon game is a huge endeavour. And if they'd tried to make a Pokemon RPG on the scale of what the games were on the Game Boy for the N64, they would have struggled, because, as we found, Final Fantasy VII went from the N64 to the PlayStation because, yeah, they wanted pre-rendered backdrops. Yes, they wanted CGI cut movies in this, cutscenes. But could the N64 have had all of like the different towns and all of the different Pokemon and everything associated with like what you'd get in Pokemon Red or Blue on an N64 cartridge in 3D? There's nothing to suggest that they definitely couldn't, but there's nothing to suggest they definitely could, because obviously it's so vast. When you look at the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and compare it like map-wise to Pokemon, I think Pokemon does actually have like more areas, more real estate that would be covered, so it would just be different on the N64. Doesn't mean they couldn't have done one, and if they'd just basically said, look, we just need to make Pokemon, look, they've got green, they've done blue, they've done yellow, so if they'd done purple, Pokemon Purple on the N64, that could have been the way they'd done it. And interestingly, just looking at the N64 logo as I'm speaking, saying about the Pokemon games, the N64 logo is made up of red and blue, then green and yellow, which are the four colours used for the original generation of Pokemon games. So what they could have done is had Pokemon Blue in Japan be the N64 game, and then in the UK and the rest of the world called it Pokemon Green. But that still would have been confusing. But anyway, so Pokemon Stadium Gold and Silver came out, and they had the monsters in 3D, and there was a third Pokemon Stadium, which goes to show how difficult they thought it would be to put all of these monsters and stuff on an N64 cartridge, that the original version of Pokemon Stadium that came out in Japan only had something like 60 monsters that you could play with. Let's see if I can get the actual statistic for you. So by the time we got Pokemon Stadium in the UK and the US, it was actually Pokemon Stadium 2, which is weird to hear. Only 42 monsters. So you couldn't get all 151 Pokemon, you could only get 42 of them. And that is absolutely crazy. And so obviously by the time they put it out worldwide, they put in, they trebled almost, or over-trebled all of the monsters that were featured. But it didn't just have the RPG aspect. Hey You Pikachu didn't come out in Europe just because there was deemed to be too many accents. And so like the US got Hey You Pikachu, which if you were, the reason I mention accents is because you'd play it with a microphone, the Nintendo 64 microphone, just to be able to control Pikachu or give instructions to Pikachu with your voice. Definitely somewhat of a novelty thing. I can't remember how well it was or wasn't received at the time. What else did we get? We got Pokemon Puzzle League and we got Pokemon Snap. So Pokemon Snap's obviously just had a new game come out on the Switch, but back in the day on the N64, Pokemon Snap was the closest there was to any kind of adventure or story mode, where you just literally go around almost like a light gun game, but snapping photos, so shooting your camera at Pokemon rather than shooting with any kind of weapon. And I get that it would have taken a long time to develop a full-fledged RPG adventure for the N64, even though the fact that there was 2 Zeldas come out and there was Paper Mario and stuff like this, it goes to show that they could have, in theory, done it if they'd really wanted to, but they didn't know that Pokemon was going to be as big, especially as big worldwide as it was. So they probably felt like, look, we can't do this. But also, and here's the more telling thing, they revitalised the Game Boy with Pokemon. The Game Boy was nigh on dead. Should have been being replaced like years earlier, but it kept going, and then the Game Boy Color kept that 8-bit Game Boy series going longer before we went to the Game Boy Advance. And the Game Boy business has always been like the handheld business, Game Boy followed by DS, now Switch, is always the bigger part of the business for Nintendo. Like the Game Boy has done better than any of its contemporary home consoles from Nintendo. Same with the DS line. And so they were like, look, if we compete with the Game Boy by putting Pokemon onto the N64 or GameCube or Wii or Wii U, then we're going to be damaging the handheld sales. And so it just never happened until the Switch, which literally is because it's a hybrid console. But anyway, let's see what else we've got. Kirby 64. Now, I remember there was going to be Kirby's Air Ride, and there may have been another potential Kirby game, but eventually we got Kirby 64, and it was just a 2D platformer. One of the few 2D platformers, but done completely with like 3D polygonal graphics. And I think people thought it was alright, but it's not spectacular. I have played it, but again, I think I didn't play it until the Wii Virtual Console. I think we spoke about the Zeldas before, and if I didn't go into them in enough depth, then we'll definitely go into them in a future solo podcast just about various Zelda games, considering it is the 35th anniversary of the Legend of Zelda series. But just absolutely incredible. One of the things I will pull out about Ocarina of Time is just that after Super Mario 64, where you could control the camera, this had got like combat where you'd use swords and shields, and they basically invented Z targeting or Z targeting, where you would lock on to an enemy, and that way you'd always be facing them so that you could have the combat. Whereas up until this point, it would just be that you're running around, and as you slash, you're trying to run away, and instead of backing up and, you'd turn your back on your opponent. And you wouldn't do that in a real fight. You'd keep your sword and shield drawn facing them. And this allowed this to happen on the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. The fact that you actually had an ocarina which you could play pretty much any song, I believe, because they'd have the C buttons, the A button, the B button, but then it could be like perhaps you hold down the shoulder button. And certainly it took me a long time before I realised that if you manipulate how you're holding, which direction the analog stick is facing, it would change the sound again. You could basically play any song on the in-game ocarina in Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask wasn't quite as good just because this whole Groundhog Day thing meant that you'd have a lot of repetition, and there'd be a lot of trial and error repetition, where if you were meant to meet someone on day 3, because like the moon is going to hit the Earth in 3 days' time, and you need to stop it, and then you time travel, and then you do the same 3 days over and over until eventually you collect enough items that you can fix things once and for all. But the fact that there'd be this timer against you, and each day would last, I think, 12 minutes. And so what you needed to do was on day 3, you might be waiting about half an hour to be able to do it. And then you suddenly do it wrong. It's like, oh no, now I need to go back and go through all day 3 days again. As you play through the game and you do better, you do get the ability to use the Ocarina of Time to manipulate time so that you can skip forward to day 2, skip forward to day 3, slow time down and stuff like this. And these things all became super necessary to be able to complete the game. But for me, I didn't like having this time limit, like pressure on the game constantly. I didn't like the idea of, having to reset things constantly. People always say it was a much darker game, and it was thematically, but it just didn't have like the same joy of exploring because of this time limit. And then the levels were the world was designed around that you'd always have this time limit, whereas on Ocarina of Time, I would just spend half an hour running around Hyrule Field, just enjoying looking at things. You know what I mean? Let's see what else we got. Mace the Dark Age. Never played it. Skipping over that. Madden Football. Sorry, NFL fans. Never played any of them. Mario Golf. Obviously, we got a lot of Mario games, and this was one of the things that Nintendo did, starting with the N64. Definitely continued through onto the GameCube, and possibly onto the Wii and Wii U. That was always a mistake. They were like, dear, let's just add Mario to everything. Now, Mario Golf is fine. We'd had Mario Kart, and that was a great game and a great idea. Mario Golf, Mario Tennis, these things are fine. But what they did, in my opinion, which to this day is still a mistake, is they missed the opportunity to build new characters and new stars for their legacy, for their roster. So if you see everything with Mario on, it's easy just to put it in a compartment in your mind of, it's another Mario game. Well, Splatoon was very almost a Mario game where they were shooting each other. And that would just be, that's Mario shooters. Mario Kart, Mario Golf, Mario shooters. But instead, it feels like there's, alongside Mario, you think, there's the characters from Splatoon, and they look like this, and I can collect the amiibos of them, and I could have them on a t-shirt, or I think this character's cool. Now, Mario was always going to have Mario 64, Galaxy, Odyssey and stuff like this, and Mario Kart. I'm not taking that away from Mario, but they could have had, just like there was Snowboard Kids, which wasn't a Nintendo game, but they could have been like the golf, like the Nintendo golf characters, the Nintendo tennis characters, and they could have had these wacky range of characters. Then it's like, this character from Nintendo Tennis is now going to be in Mario Kart. But instead, that character from Nintendo Tennis in Mario Kart is just Mario. But anyway, so we got Mario Party, and that's one where I completely agree that Mario makes sense to be in those games. Nintendo basically invented the party game with this, where you'd have like a board game, you'd roll dice, you'd move along, you'd do mini games, and they even took this further, not on the N64, but like on the Game Boy Advance with WarioWare, where it'd be micro games. So they just extended these ideas, and they're the absolute masters of party games and then the micro games, multiplayer, fun together like that. Let's go through, see what else we've got. Mission Impossible, people were hyping that up like it was going to be we've got Mission Impossible as well as GoldenEye, but then eventually it was it's coming to PS1 as well. And everyone was like, this is just awful compared to GoldenEye. Wasn't a great game in its own right. Not the worst thing in the world, though. But I never completed it. Had it, never completed it. We got a bunch of Mortal Kombat games on the N64. We got Mortal Kombat Trilogy, which I think on the N64 may have been limited compared to on the PS1, and so people like this is a bad game. We got Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero, which was the 2D brawler RPG kind of game with like the pre-rendered graphics. It was 2D, and again, people said it was a terrible game. Never had it myself. Mortal Kombat 4, I had it, but not on the N64. I think I had Mortal Kombat Gold, which is basically the same game on the Dreamcast. That was fun. It took Mortal Kombat into 3D, but it was Mortal Kombat in 3D, and if anything, you know, it didn't have like the digitized graphics. Now it was the 3D graphics, which didn't make it stand out compared to like Tekken and things like this. And so really moving from 2D to 3D games, it was an opportunity where some games went to the next level being in 3D, others didn't. And it took both Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter years to kind of have their resurgence, and which interestingly now, games like Tekken and Virtua Fighter have very much fallen by the wayside. Let's see what else we got. Mystical Ninja starring Goemon. I remember that the first one was like an RPG slash Mario 64 style game, and it was really good, but then they did the next one and it may have been a 2D game. Let's have a look. Yeah, a 2D game. So weird that they changed it up going in that direction. It was the wrong era to be going 2D. But maybe it needs another look because it might be really good. NBA Hang Time. I love NBA Hang Time. I played it on the Sega Mega Drive. I'd love to actually play it on the Nintendo 64 and just see what it's like, because for all I know, it might be really good. It might have much better graphics. And I know that I don't think it got hugely great reviews, but if I liked it on the Mega Drive, I might really like an enhanced N64 version. Loads of other NBA games, NFL, blah, 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 blah. Skip these. Perfect Dark, we spoke about last time. Pilot Wings, one of the launch games. And it's one of these things where it's famous for being a Nintendo game. Usually, I think the only games for Pilot Wings that have ever actually come out have been launch games. Pilot Wings for the Super Nintendo, Pilot Wings 64 for the 64, and then eventually Pilot Wings Resort for the 3DS. It's not always seen as an essential thing. It's a good thing to show off graphics, and that's what it did with Mode 7 graphics on the Super Nintendo. It could obviously show off pretty 3D graphics, including like Mount Rushmore on the N64, and then it would be a good showcase for 3D graphics on the 3DS. But realistically, if it's just a game to show off the graphics, it's an interesting series for that reason. But anyway, let's move on, see what else we got. Quake 64, Quake 2. I think I had them both on the N64, definitely Quake 2. Thought it was really good. Good version of the game as well. I think I played Rampage World Tour, and I don't really remember that much about it. Ready to Rumble Boxing 1 and 2. I didn't remember that 2 came out. But, it didn't come out in the UK. But Ready to Rumble Boxing, I played on the Dreamcast, and it was like a great game then. And it was one of these ones, a little bit like that Fighter's Destiny, where when it first appeared, it caught people's attention and imagination, but then it couldn't maintain it for the sequel, and then the franchise died. Resident Evil 2 on the N64. Now, I'm going to have a lot to say about Resident Evil games across these podcasts, but also on the Extreme Improv YouTube channel. I'm going to have a series of videos coming up about the Resident Evil and survival horror genre of games. And Resident Evil 2 on the N64 was a miracle that it came out, because it was, I think, along with perhaps Conker's Bad Fur Day with all of the speech in it, it was like maybe joint biggest cartridge released on the N64, because they even managed to put the CGI cutscenes on it, which may have been the only time that they happened on the N64, or there may have been one other. But the N64 game of Resident Evil 2 had everything that was in the PlayStation version, which was incredible, because they was like, this got 2 CDs worth of game and all these cutscenes and all the dialogue on the N64. Now, as we all know, Resident Evil 2 didn't really need to be on 2 CDs on the PlayStation, and still fitting a whole CD's worth of game onto the N64 was impressive, especially with the dialogue, especially with the 2D pre-rendered backgrounds, and especially with all of like the voiceover stuff. Wasn't comparable to like the 3 or 4 CD Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9 games, but it was still very impressive that they managed to squeeze it onto a cartridge. Resident Evil 0 was shown off, planned for the N64, and eventually was moved to the GameCube, just when it was clear that the N64 wasn't going to be the future. Let's see what else we got here. I'm not going to do this in 3 parts, so let's power through, see what some of the other things. Yes, Scooby-Doo Classic Creep Capers. This was a Resident Evil style game starring Scooby-Doo, and I'm not even joking. The controls on it aren't the greatest, and they actually, at the time, because it had got like the pre-rendered backgrounds, when you'd run to the edge of a screen and you then appear with like the camera angle having flipped, like sometimes it'd be like the control wouldn't orientate to have you running, like just keep on running up, and you'd just end up running back and forth between 2 screens, which was frustrating. But then later, when they re-released the Resident Evil games on the PS3, PS4, like the original games when they were remade, then it had similar controls. So who knows? Who knows? Scooby-Doo Classic Creep Capers was ahead of its time. Shadow Man, on the similar theme of Resident Evil, was seen as, well, this is the N64's survival horror kind of experience. And for me, it was more like Tomb Raider to me than Resident Evil. And even though it was like dark themed, voodoo, death, whatever, that wasn't quite what I was in for Resident Evil 4. I liked the sci-fi conspiracy-ness of it anyway. But Shadow Man was another of these games which ended up getting a sequel, and the sequel just kind of was like forgotten, overlooked, because the hype of the first one gave the first one its success, but then people weren't interested enough for the sequel. Let's see, South Park. I remember that South Park originally came out on the N64, and then I think later for the PlayStation, and it was like a Doom, Quake style game, and people liked it. I don't know how much people still like it, but I remember at the time it got some hype around it. Superman 64, notoriously known as the worst game of all time. Now, I can say that other than perhaps quickly on a ROM, I've never played Superman 64 because I've read the reviews, and you'd just fly through rings, and like the controls were meant to be bad, and it's just like on Super Mario 64 where you're flying through rings on like Bob-omb Battlefield to complete a star. It would be challenging. You'd be pleased once you've got the task done, because then you don't have to do it again and you feel like you've achieved something. But imagine if that is a big part of the entire game. So apparently that's what Superman 64 was, and the controls might have been awful. Super Smash Brothers. So this is a game which, obviously, this was 2 or 3 years after Fighters Megamix on the Sega Saturn. We got Super Smash Brothers, which, whereas Fighters Megamix took Sonic the Fighters, the arcade game of Sonic the Hedgehog fighting, and it took Daytona USA's car, and it took characters from Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers, and it was like this big Sega mashup, all fighting each other. Super Smash Brothers was the same, but for Nintendo. It had characters, and there weren't tons of characters, maybe 10 or 12 on the original game, but it took characters from the Mario universe, like Mario and Luigi and Donkey Kong. Obviously, Donkey Kong was its own thing as well, so you could say that was from a slightly different universe. It took Samus from Metroid, I believe, and it took maybe Captain Falcon, or maybe it wasn't until the sequel, but I can't really remember off the top of my head, but Captain Falcon from F-Zero, and I'm trying to think who else would have been on the original one, like maybe Kid Icarus, or maybe Kid Icarus was just on the sequel, but then it would have characters from Zelda, like if it was Link or whatever, and they'd all be fighting each other. And, of course, in Pokemon, so it'd have Pikachu on there, like 1 or 2 other Pokemon, and it would be this big brawl of which Nintendo fighter character is the best. And it almost didn't come out because the idea of the characters fighting each other wasn't seen as Nintendo, but then, it became one of Nintendo's biggest games across I think on the GameCube, Smash Brothers was the biggest selling game, in fact. But still, on all of the consoles, Smash Brothers is a really big selling game. Tetris 64. There was a Tetris game on the N64 where you'd like plug your finger into something and it would read your like panic from your heartbeat. I wish that was something that was explored more in games, but apparently it didn't work super well. But I like that idea as a thing. So Panic Tetris. Tetrasphere was Tetris around a sphere. I think more things should be put around spheres. Just change the games to be around spheres. It worked for Mario Galaxy. It worked for Sonic in Blue Sphere. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Uno, Dos, and Tres. 3 games of it. I played them on the PlayStation. Won't talk about them here. Turret games we talked about in the last episode, and I think that kind of brings me towards the end of the list. Other than Yoshi's Story we covered before. So, what's this? Unreleased games, 40 Winks. Now that was eventually released about a year or two ago, wasn't it? So 2019, how about that? 2019 was the last N64 game getting released. That was 40 Winks. Had it on the PS1. Glover 2 never came out. And these, a couple of unreleased games. But let me just go through and I'll give you my recommendations. So I'm going to go through the whole list now and I'll pull out the ones that I think people should play. Or just to be of some quick note. I'm not a massive fan myself, but 1080 Snowboarding is seen as a good snowboarding game. Let's see what else. Banjo-Kazooie. Yep, Banjo-Tooie. It's not as good as Kazooie, but definitely worth giving a go, especially if you enjoy the original. I didn't speak about the Bomberman games or Buck Bumble, but they're all right. Buster Move 2, Buster Move 3DX are good games. Chameleon Twist is another platformer. The first one I definitely played and I thought it was quite good. The second one might also be alright. Can't remember if I played it though. Let's see what else. Conker's Bad Fur Day, definitely you should play that. Cruising USA, Cruising World, Cruising Exotica, if you want a racing game, they're a bit of fun. Doom 64 is worth playing. Donkey Kong 64 is a definite that you should play. Diddy Kong Racing is a must that you should play. Dr. Mario 64 is a fun puzzly game, as is Pokemon Puzzle League, but I'll get to that later. Duke Nukem 64, just based on Duke Nukem 3D, is a good first-person shooter. Let's see what else is here. I wouldn't say to play ECW Hardcore Revolution over WWF Attitude, but if you want to, you can do. Let's see what else. F-Zero X is a good game. Gex 64 is a good game. GoldenEye 64 is obviously a very good game. Scrolling down, let's see what else we have here. If you really want to play Killer Instinct Gold, you can do. But there are other better fighting games, even on the N64. But it is still a solid release from Rare. Then, of course, Mario Kart 64 is essential. Mario Tennis, I'd say, isn't quite essential, but it is up there. Mickey Speedway USA isn't essential compared to Mario Kart or Diddy Kong Racing, but it is definitely the third in that line of kart racers on the platform. Let's see what else we've got. Okay, so Pokemon Stadium is very good, but in particular, you need to have one of the Game Boy games. Same with Pokemon Stadium 2. You need to have, for the first one, you need Pokemon Red or Blue or Yellow. For Pokemon Stadium Gold or Silver, you can use Red, Blue, and Yellow, but you'd also need, Gold and Silver. I can't remember if Crystal works with it. I think it does, but maybe it doesn't. So, and that allows you to use the Game Boy Pokemon on the N64 game, otherwise you're just using stock characters, which you haven't been able to train up in the same way. Let's see, Resident Evil 2, I'd say is an essential game. Let's see, Robotron 64, didn't talk about that earlier, it's quite fun, not essential though. Super Mario 64, 100% essential. Snowboard Kids is a good one. Star Fox 64 I didn't talk about earlier, released in the UK as Lilac Wars, and that's a very fun game. The best Star Fox game of all time, undoubtedly, and it still holds up well today, so I'd definitely say play Lilac Wars. There's Star Wars games, Pod Race, like Star Wars Episode 1, Racer, Star Wars Rogue Squadron, and Battle for Naboo. These are all good games. Shadow of the Empire was one of the early games, may have even been launched, or very shortly after launch. Let's see when it came out. March 1st, 1997, so I'd forgot that was a launch title. Let's see what else we got. Mario 64 already mentioned. Super Smash Brothers. For me, it isn't quite essential, but for most people, I'd say, yeah, definitely, pick it up. But it's just because I don't have 100% preference for the Smash Brothers gameplay style. But I still recognise that it is a lot of fun. Turok 2, for me, the best Turok game was Turok Rage Wars. But Turok 2 is good. Turok 3, the first one is good, but it's harder to go back to. Let's see what else we've got. Wave Race 64, I'd kind of say, again, similar to 1080, and I think it was from the same team. If that's your bag, then you might enjoy it. If not, then you probably find missing it. WCW, Backstage Assault is a no. Mayhem never came out in the UK. Or did it? According to this, it did. If it came out in the UK... Oh no, that's Mayhem. WCW Nitro. Mayhem isn't essential. Nitro isn't essential. WCW versus NWO World Tour is very good. WCW versus NWO Revenge is very good. Wet Tricks, I wish I'd got into it, but I never did. Let's see, what else? Worms Armageddon. If you like Worms games, may be essential. The World is not enough. The follow-up, but not from Rare, to GoldenEye. So... Whereas Tomorrow Never Dies came out just on the PlayStation 1 and wasn't a very good game, and wasn't even a first-person shooter. The World Is Not Enough was Eurocom made it, released by Electronic Arts, and it was trying to be GoldenEye again. It wasn't as good, but it is still good. It's at least good, if not very good, and I'd recommend people get it. But it's not as good as GoldenEye. WWF Attitude, I'd say get. No Mercy and Warzone and WrestleMania 2000, I'd say get. If you like wrestling games, if not, then don't get them. Yoshi's Story, I'd say, isn't quite essential, but if you like the Mario universe, then it's as near to essential as you can be. I said I'd talk about the N64 disk drive, which I will talk about briefly. Obviously, there was a lot of things that were planned for the N64 disk drive, and we can do another whole episode just talking about that. I never had one, but I know its history quite well, followed its progress at the time, was always planning to get one because back in the day it was said that Super Mario 64 2 would be for the disk drive, that Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, or then the expansion thing for it, which people thought, oh, is this Majora's Mask? But then it's like, no, there's going to be a different one. And people have never been quite clear what Legend of Zelda things were going to come out on the disk drive. But obviously nothing did. There was the Mario Artist series that did release. There was SimCity 64, or I believe it was called that did release on it. There was Doshin the Giant, which later would come out just in Europe on the GameCube. And there was the F-Zero expansion kit, so you could design your own levels. And there may have been a couple of other things, but there was almost nothing for the Nintendo 64 disk drive. I applaud Nintendo for going through with releasing it in Japan at all. But there were so many things. I even think at times they were saying Donkey Kong 64 or Banjo-Tooie were going to come out on the disk drive, but in the end it didn't happen. The original machine didn't sell well enough for that in the end. So anyway, that brings me towards the end of this, the second part of my retrospective of the Nintendo 64. So what I will just say is, once again, I hope you enjoy this show. The show's only going to get better the more episodes we do, the more things we'll be able to dive into. Let us know what you'd like to hear. I like doing these nostalgia based episodes, but also I always like to cover when we had E3 a couple of weeks back, covering those events. So I will have lots more episodes of the Games Monster podcast coming up soon. Make sure you subscribe on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. Also go over to youtube.com/extremeimprov and smash that subscribe button there, just because you'll be able to get loads of gaming content, including video reviews and some documentary series coming up on there. We also have our weekly Geek Battle show, which is covering all things geeky, not just games, but also cult TV shows, fandom TV shows, that kind of stuff. And of course we have loads of articles, videos, podcasts and loads more that you can find on the website www.extremes.tv, spelt xstreamed.tv. So it's streamed like I live streamed today, but it's X streamed. So just the letter X, streamed.tv. My name's David Pistansky. From me, from everyone else in the world of Extreme Improv Extreme, stay safe and ciao for now.